So the audience is pretty limited.
Okay. I think we're going to start now, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I know it's the difficult session just before lunch because everyone wants to eat, but let's get through it. So this session is to discuss the civic and political space in Bahrain. As you know, it's been completely shut down over the past 8 years. There's been the shutdown of the political opposition of Al-Wafaq and Wa'ad, and the silencing of human rights defenders. So I'm going to introduce the panel first. We've got Fadi Al-Qadi, who is an independent human rights expert, Drury Dyke next to him, who is representing Salam, and then Joe Stork, who's on the advisory board of Bahrain Center for Human Rights and Gulf Center for Human Rights. So my first question to you all is, faced with this hugely challenging situation, what can be done to reopen civil society space in Bahrain?
You want to answer that question?
I can have a go.
I'll start if you want.
Please.
Okay. I think it would be helpful to bring a little perspective, historical perspective, if I may use that term. You know, the silence that we're talking about is really not international, frankly. The silence is in Bahrain. It's an enforced silence. And, you know, it's not the first time that civil society has been crushed, has been silenced in Bahrain. When I first became engaged in Bahrain in my first visit in 1996, it was the start of the opening years of what was known then as the Bahraini Intifada, the uprising. And that had a context too. So if you look at the period, now, I guess the prior point to make is that in contradistinction to almost every other place in the Gulf, certainly other small states in the Gulf, Bahrain did have a relatively vibrant and active civil society, trade unions, etc. The periods of repression under the British and then under the independent, the monarchy, the Khalifa, or it wasn't even a monarchy until 2000, but the emirate, it was relatively episodic, but after particularly 1975, it became quite severe. And then after the Iranian Revolution in 1981, you had it was a real desert in terms of political activity. And so the suppression was really fierce. I mean, frankly, what's going on today doesn't quite match up to what was going on from roughly 1981 to 1995 or even 1999. Now, what changed that, I think, what had to do with to some extent, the international, but particularly the regional context. So what you saw in around 1993, 94, 95, what later morphed into the Intifada was the so-called petition movement, where people like Sheikh al-Jamri and so forth were leading very large marches of people that were cross-division. I mean, they were not just Shia, or even, maybe not even majority Shia. I don't know. I wasn't there at the time, but they were definitely composites of society, really, who were marching to present a petition to the emir to institute certain reforms, chief among them some sort of parliament, elected parliament. And again, recall that in 1973 there were elections to a parliament in Bahrain. Now it was a very restricted election. The number of the seats were appointed rather than elected, and so forth. But it was an experience that most of the other states, all of them except Kuwait, never had. So this was this demand for parliament, for democratic expression, and so forth, was not completely new. It was renewed in the context of what went on in the 1989-91 period, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the liberation of Kuwait by the US-led coalition, the demands that were, because of that context, the demands that were put on Kuwait, if you recall, to liberalize, quote unquote, the Bahrainis took that up, and also remember that in that time there was a lot more exchange of civil society and political actors between Bahrain and Kuwait, Bahrain and the Emirates, and so forth, than there is today, where it's been, constricted to almost invisibility. So it was in that context that civil society was activated, in my view, in Bahrain in the early and mid-1990s. And it was really that context that led then to the reforms when the king took over after his father died, coincidentally after meeting with the U.S. Secretary of Defense. But I think that's just coincidence. And the reforms that were instituted, the National Compact and so forth of 2000, 2001, 2002, were really, they were unfortunately the high points of this activism and the fruits of this activism, because then in 2002 you had the king sort of taking over and imposing unilaterally this new constitution, which was highly problematic, highly restrictive in a lot of ways. And then up through 2011, really, you had a struggle over the terms of that new constitution and so forth, and the issue of elections and to participate or not to participate and so forth. So civil society and political activism, exercise of political rights in Bahrain has a history, which is what makes it really distinct from, I think, the rest of the Gulf. And even internationally, if you want to talk about silence, I mean, look at UAE, okay? There you see international silence. And I think one of the reasons, not the whole reason, and one is the UAE has a lot more money, a lot more contracts to pass out, but also it does not have that history or that record of civil activity. It's not part of its history. And I think that's, for reasons I couldn't even begin to explain, but I think it's a fact. And I think it has a lot to do with why you did see, and why it's so striking now, and the loss is so grievously felt of the lack of political space, civic space in Bahrain today.
I mean, that's really helpful, Joe. Thanks very much. Look, I guess we've touched on a lot of these issues already, and Khaled has spoken very forcefully to the closure of civil society in Bahrain. Brian, I think, has talked a little bit about actual concrete steps. Now, to the extent that your question, Ariel, to the extent that I can remember it, was steps to reopen civil society. I guess we who are engaged in this field, or what is a very small country, with our backs up against the wall, where there is little to no political support from the usual suspects, maybe to some degree European Union, some parliamentarians and so on and so forth, but not big stuff, where we've discussed a little bit about the difficulties we've got with the UK government, the US as well. So I think to a big degree, to a large degree, it falls to us in what is actually quite a fractured civil society movement, albeit largely outside Bahrain. As Sheikh Maytham said at the beginning, yes, there are some groups there are active in a restricted context. So I guess I would like to see us act in a coordinated way to avoid some of the pitfalls that I think, again, Brian talked about in terms of the Human Rights Council, sort of long-term engagement, to try and get easy wins and to try and, easy wins, none of them are very easy. It was Martin Luther King Day the other day, and again, there was a reminder of some of the statements he made in respect of, you've got to seize it. It's incumbent upon you. No one's going to help Bahrainis. The friends and activists that we have assembled here today, and some outside this room as well, I think it's down to us to coordinate what we're doing, and hopefully in our session this afternoon, when we get together to think of some concrete actions, we can come up to that. We've got to take the fight, civil fight, to the authorities, in a hope that, to some degree, that it will show the authorities that closure of civil society is a dead-end process, that it will, over time, mount pressure on the government. I think some articles were saying around the time of the election, by way of example, that closure of civil society, failure to engage with an opposition, has an economic cost. There is an opportunity cost of repression. And I guess I'd like all of us to try and think about ways to tackle that.
Yeah. Well, I would like also to, I mean, I don't have a specific answer to that sort of like overall question of what do we do, what do we advise, because, you know, I'm sort of being also an Arab, seeing the regional context and seeing sort of like the micro, not necessarily the macro level where international sort of scrutiny over Bahrain is required and necessary and has been always helpful. And I'm seeing a deadlock on the regional level, which is a micro level. So, and there is no sort of Arab solidarity, you know, with the cause of Bahrain and what is going on in terms of I think I would rather use the term erasure, you know, it's been erased rather than just closed or declined. That's specific civic space where people associate, express, and assemble, and, you know, just like engage in peaceful, meaningful activities. So that is gone. But on that sort of micro level, again, sort of the regional context, and because we have major powers in the region, UAE, Saudi Arabia, not necessarily Egypt, are dominating that. Now, UAE is in a much sort of stronger position than the Saudis after MBS involvement in Jamal Khashoggi's murder. Nevertheless, that sort of, and it's not institutionalized by any way. We don't necessarily see, maybe Khalid's not here, maybe Khalid disagrees with that. We're not seeing sort of a good bulk of Arab human rights NGOs and civil society organizations stepping forward, you know, to support the Bahraini cause. But they don't also, you know, there is also, I mean, the same context is applicable to other countries. You don't see a lot of them coming out to, you know, to support, you know, Syrian cause, Egyptian sort of, you know, human rights defenders. It's just like this is the state of affairs in this region. Very fragmented, very deeply sort of, you know, cracked upon, you know, civil society movement and human rights defenders and institutions in the Arab region. So, yes, that's it. But on the other hand, I think, you know, there is also a critical issue of looking at the alternatives within Bahrain itself, rather. Because, you see, I mean, civil society in its ultimate sort of operation and functioning is offering the peaceful, you know, that's what I mean, the human rights, you know, folks sitting on this table are concerned with support for civil society in terms of expression and assembly and association in sort of a peaceful context. And this is the risk, I think, that we are no longer able, and I think probably we're talking practically, operationally, we're not able to offer a sort of like a viable, sort of convincing, you know, peaceful alternative to hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of youth and, you know, political activists who are seeing deadlocks everywhere, you know. There is nowhere to move. And I would like also to sort of, you know, to sort of recapture what are the main facets of the erasure of or closure of civic space. And they have been, by the way, spelled out. In July, last year, the government of Bahrain submitted its first report to the ICCPR? I think it was its first report. And the topics, the usual topics of ICCPR are very related to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. Typically, those are the areas. And regardless of the fact that, the government's report was very detailed, descriptive of so-called measures and procedures and laws that the government has carried out to sort of in respect of human rights, I think we should all look at the committee's observations of that report. They are, I think, and I view them as a very articulate document of, the state of civic space in Bahrain. They talk, and they have been sort of descriptive in terms of using examples and cases to the maximum extent. And that's, probably thanks to to Bahraini human rights organizations, civil society organizations. They talk about issues that goes beyond even the traditional sort of discussion on freedom of assembly and freedom of association and freedom of expression and their interrelatedness. They're talking about reprisals as a critical and crucial element in sort of closing that civic space, that people are not, activists are not having the liberty to move within that space because of